Hi everyone. So I think we can start. I see a lot of people is still standing, so if you could slowly come to the room and the session. Okay.
Hi, Sophie.
Oh, hi, Janet. Okay, so welcome everyone to another session of HRPC. This is a research group that is part of the IETF, and today we're going to be having kind of a short session because all of the speakers were not able to make it for this time, but we were going to actually have them in the next IETF. So just as a reminder for everybody, please note that this session is being recorded and eventually the videos are going to be uploaded to YouTube. And just to start on the usual path that obviously we are in the third day of the IETF, so probably you already saw all of this note well. So please note it very well. And here are the two mandatory slides on that. And prior to actually start the meeting itself, I would like to request either someone in the room or in the chat if there will be the person taking notes. So do we have like a volunteer for that? Just let me know in the chat or in the microphone. We do need one. Well, I don't see any volunteers, so maybe I'm going to ask if Jonathan, you could be the volunteer for. Okay. Okay, thank you.
Sorry, I'm struggling to get my computer going. Yes.
Okay, perfect. So thank you, Jonathan. So we had already a note taker. So hopefully that's sorted out. Yes. So just to get started, we basically would have this agenda that is pretty short, as you see. Basically the welcome, which is what we're having right now. And then we're going to be having two talks. One by Nathan Schneider about democracy on, not just around the internet. And also another talk by Ali Rezaki from Nokia Standards. So with that, which is to remind you that we are this group from the IETF. If you're interested in more information about us, I have also listed the website over here, but you can also obviously check us in the data tracker. And with that, I would like to invite Nathan. If you're ready, I have your slides. Okay, cool. I'm going to share your slides. Give me a second.
Yes, I'm ready. Do you have them?
Yes. You should be seeing them. Okay, cool.
Okay. And I'm going half an hour, right?
Yes. Can you move the slides yourself, or can you do it, or should I?
I don't know how.
Okay, I will do it. Just let me know. Okay. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much for this opportunity to be here. I'm Nathan Schneider. I'm a professor of media studies at the University of Colorado Boulder. And I'm going to share some ideas that come particularly out of my recent book called Governable Spaces, which is available open access from the University of California Press, as well as work that comes out of my collaborations through particularly an organization called Metagov, which you can learn more about it at metagov.org. And I hope that these ideas, which are, I'll share in pretty broad strokes, are useful framing just for thinking about the future of human rights and protocol design, which is a growing interest of mine. As I did this more historical work, came to recognize the power of technical protocols in shaping and defining rights. Could you advance to the next? So you may recall that in 2016 or after 2016, the US presidential election, the major social media networks found themselves in a sort of crisis. The masters of the universe, so to speak, Mark Zuckerberg, Jack Dorsey, started behaving in a kind of peculiar way for people who have been accumulating so much power for so long. They started trying to give away power. They started trying to get rid of power. For Mark Zuckerberg, this took the form of a kind of liberal democratic intervention or liberal human rights intervention, maybe informing the oversight board, a nonprofit, separate organization with kind of prominent human rights figureheads as members to oversee the activities of what now Meta's platforms, and to provide a kind of external buffer of accountability. For Jack Dorsey, the form this crisis turned into was a kind of protocol intervention in seeding what would become now Blue Sky and the protocol, essentially proposing to decentralize Twitter to the point where people would have exit options and where Twitter was no longer just a simple company, but was instead a decentralized network. He was contending over these years that Twitter never should have been a company. Again, kind of peculiar moves, but actually not so odd if you've ever run an online community. One of the motivators for writing this book for me was just a frustrating experience I had running an online community, in this case, a mailing list, an old kind of, SIMPA email list in which I realized I had way more power than I actually wanted, right? I, as the person who just happened to start the email list, had absolute control over who got banned and who was allowed to speak, what was preserved in the archives. There were no mechanisms to enable me to appropriately consult or engage the participants in the list on how I should make those decisions. I would have to kind of bend over backwards and work against the defaults of the system. And in a funny way, an email list with 500 people started to feel, started to teach me a kind of sympathy with the plight of these poor gentlemen. Unfortunately, I, unlike them, was not making billions of dollars in order to do it. Nevertheless, if you could change this slide, please. This started me on the path of first a historical analysis of a pattern that I've come to call implicit feudalism. Now, the term is as cartoonish and kind of reductive as the name. Feudalism, of course, being a historical term developed really after the Middle Ages to ridicule the Middle Ages by people who are trying to take power in new ways. And invented a kind of cartoonish picture of what they thought the European Middle Ages was like in order to do land grabs and stuff like that. But in fact, their picture of that medieval system is actually quite accurate when we imagine how online communities are set up. The kind of technical biases built into the structure of online life. For instance, all power held by first the server admin, then in the case of particular communities, the person who creates the community. All power flows from them. It is an absolute power. It is delegated. It is not generally revocable, particularly by the participants in the community. And enforcement occurs essentially through the digital equivalents of censorship or exile. And so we find ourselves in a world very much like this kind of caricature of medieval feudalism, in which you have a bunch of fiefdoms controlled through a kind of absolute and unchangeable power structure, using pretty crass modes of conflict resolution. And this is what we've come to accept as normal. Could you change the slide? This system derives from a kind of technical convenience. It first arose in the earliest online communities. I particularly look at the emergence in the context of BBS networks. These were often systems running out of somebody's house or out of their office, quite informally. And the norm that took hold was an assumption that, okay, the server is in my house, you're a guest in my house. That was the kind of social logic that got imprinted on these networks and got written into how the software was developed. An assumption that if somebody is able to unplug the server, they have a kind of absolute power over that system. And therefore, all the tools built in to enable them to better run their systems were built in with the assumption that that sysadmin was a source of absolute power. This logic began in these kind of informal communities, was developed as a sort of convenience, replicated the structure of the server itself, replicated the structure of the permissions systems of the computers that these systems were running on. And so it was all kind of a extension of convenience. And yet this is a logic that ends up spreading to the biggest social networks. As we move from a world in which the social communities are being run in out of a computer in somebody's house to one in which they're being run by some of the largest corporations in the world, this logic stuck and became something that people don't even question. In this time, in the, say, 80s and 90s, there were experiments with democratic decision-making in these contexts, but often these experiments would run up against certain realities and how the networks were designed. For instance, people would recognize, oh, the server's sitting in my house or in my office. I am kind of legally accountable for whatever goes on there. So I need to be able to have some absolute power. And so the structure of the network in putting so much power in the server ends up kind of reinforcing this logic. Could you change the slide? So this could be a kind of just innocent fact about online life, except that online life has become the fabric of social life in general, more and more. And the way we organize in social life has consequences. I draw particularly on this tradition of political thought that comes from sources including Alexis de Tocqueville in Democracy in America, or W.B. Du Bois and his concept of abolition democracy, or C.L.R. James, particularly in his essay, Every Cook Can Govern, who's an anti-colonial activist and writer in the mid-20th century. And in this tradition, Robert Putnam is probably the major figure in political science. And if there's a film about to come out about him and this whole story, the idea is that to practice democracy at large scales, you need to be able to experience it and practice it at the smaller scales in our everyday lives. And that the bedrock of democracy in, say, a government is people's participation in smaller scale democracies through civic associations, bowling leagues, things that seemingly have nothing to do with politics, but which actually enable people to develop those essential political skills. And so if in our online spaces, we are practicing a kind of feudalism and we're unable to access the means of other sorts of participation, maybe that is a bad thing. I was struck as I was wrestling with this problem in my 500-person email list with conversations with my mother, where she was telling me about the garden club that she had just been elected president of. And she shared with me the bylaws of that garden club. And I realized at that moment that I had never been in an online community with such robust forms of self-governance as her garden club. So I began to think of the challenge that we find ourselves in as how can we catch up our online communities with my mother's garden club. Could you change, please? So one approach to this kind of challenge is to begin with the communities themselves. We can start to bend over backwards within our communities to try to figure out how do we open doors to different kinds of governance structures. This is something I've done a lot in my practice, both in larger scales, like for instance at the top, I was part of an initiative to do a shareholder proposal at Twitter back in 2017 to try to get the company to convert to a more resilient form of shared ownership that wouldn't end up making it vulnerable to an acquisition. And when that was not quite successful, a group of us who were part of that campaign started our own Mastodon server, social.coop, a cooperatively governed Mastodon instance on the ActivityPub protocol. And that was a really instructive process because it made me realize how much we would have to do in order to develop a democratic practice in an online social space. We had to set up we had to do governance in a tool called Lumio. We had to set up another, a wiki in order to manage our documents. We had to set up a whole bunch of different spaces just in order to practice a little bit of basic democracy in how we operated a relatively small space. I looked also to communities that are trying to figure out how to do collective governance online today. One such context is that of blockchains. This is one space where actually the structure of the network has changed. No longer are we relying on the assumption that a service is built out of a central server, but instead the value proposition is that you have to have some kind of distributed control of a particular currency or organization built on top of it. And it has forced a kind of explosion of interest in the question of how to self-govern online. At the same time, though, for most of the rest of us, this remains inaccessible. And one community that I think is really telling is among people who are trying to do work known as like restorative or especially transformative justice. People are trying to build alternatives to addressing harm that don't involve violence or police or prisons. And among the activists building these kinds of alternatives, often who are very, very online in their own practice, they warn in handbooks like this: don't do these processes online. If you're even thinking about it, stop. And I think that's really telling, again, about how much the defaults built into our online systems are designed against the kind of self-governance that people actually might need to do in the world. That the systems that we've come to rely on do not allow, for instance, the kind of customization, the kind of crafting that we need in order to solve collective problems. Could you turn, please? So I think we need to think about turning how we approach the relationship between democracy and our online networks upside down. In particular, we need to stop thinking about democracy and the internet as separate, right? What is the internet doing to democracy? We hear that question a lot. What should democracy do to the internet? We hear that question a lot when these CEOs get hauled before Congress. Rarely do we ask the question, how can we use democracy to solve problems through our networks, through the internet, where we find ourselves? How can we, rather than assuming the solution to the problem is to tell a CEO to solve it, how can we instead create the conditions where people can actually work to solve these problems themselves and are empowered to do so. And I think this involves rethinking how we do design, both of our technologies and our policy. So could you turn to the next slide? So first with technologies, I think it begins, as this group begins, with recognizing that protocol design has consequences for political and social life. And by protocols, I think of that, I think of protocols in a really broad way. I think of protocols in terms of technical protocols, but also recognizing that it's not an accident that something like the Kyoto Protocol is also called protocol. These are voluntary agreements among agents. And also, I've been really interested in the way in which protocol is a term that has been used by many indigenous communities that have lost access to state or do not have access to state power to describe systems of and flows of power among them. And to recognize that we need the power to design our technological lives much more carefully and creatively than we have been allowed to so far. That this is a game we should all be getting into. In MetaGov, we've developed a framework that we call modular politics, an approach to designing digital systems that enable composable and highly flexible forms of governance design, rather than assuming that either the current norm of implicit feudalism or some other norm of online governance is the one-size-fits-all solution. Instead, to recognize that every community should have the ability to choose the governance techniques that are appropriate to it. But it's not enough to simply approach this from a technical perspective. Could you change the slide, please? I argue that that a big part of the challenge is to recognize the way in which we're working with legal and financial forces driving the development of our technical systems that encourage and in some ways compel us into forms of centralized control. So it is important to develop forms of democratic governance into our tools, but actually the moments where this has occurred, have arisen in moments where external structures of power have actually invited that. So for instance, I mentioned earlier the rise of blockchains as one example of a space where there's been a tremendous influx of interest and activity and investment in designing online governance. And this is because the nature of the networks changed and the flows of money in those networks changed. Another example of this that I think is really important is cases where governments, like for instance, the city of Barcelona has been a really leading one, have actually stepped out and said, we want to allow the power to flow differently in our communities. And Barcelona, for instance, sponsored the development of Decidem, which is a platform that enables this kind of modular politics. You can download different modules as if they're WordPress plugins and create different kinds of consultative processes that have enabled many cities and other kind of jurisdictions to adopt the tool and customize it to their needs. So the question of designing these online systems has to begin externally to them. We have to recognize that our system designs are built by forces beyond those systems. And that's why I think a really critical necessity in enabling democratically governable online spaces also requires ensuring we have financial models that enable investment in community ownership, enable the growth and development of things like my little social.coop social media ecosystem, or models that would enable a company like Twitter to actually make that transition in a feasible and appropriate way, where capital can be directed toward enabling communities to really own and govern the tools that they use. I think it also means listening to those frustrated CEOs and enabling more power to flow into the hands of users and workers rather than putting all the accountability at the top. And this can take many different forms. You know, this could look like rethinking something like Section 230 around how accountability flows around online systems. Maybe if they're more democratically governed, that allows, you know, the companies that host those communities to defer accountability away from themselves. It also means enabling things like worker organizing among gig workers, among people who are creators on these platforms, so that they can really have a collective voice. Often the law actually prevents people who are working in online contexts from organizing and developing collective power and collective voice. So in so many ways, it's about asking ourselves the question of why can't we co-govern more easily? Why can't we organize and come together? And often there is a law or another kind of structural constraint that prevents us from being able to even begin the conversation about collective governance in online spaces. And this extends to the hardware as well. You know, in Colorado, where I live, we have, some of our communities are fortunate enough to have, for instance, rural electric cooperatives that have deployed really, really high quality broadband internet. This works super well. In the community where I'm in, it's a tech hub, Boulder, Colorado, but we have terrible internet service compared to rural communities miles and miles away from us that have these electric cooperatives, and so are owning and governing already the fiber that they rely on. So there are lots of different approaches to thinking about this, but I think it depends on rethinking our policy strategies from, again, using democracy as a cudgel against the internet and toward using democracy as a tool for problem solving. Can you turn to the next slide? Ta-da, the end. If you're interested in exploring these kinds of questions more, I'd love to invite you to both read my free book and also get involved in the MetaGov community at metagov.org. We run mainly on a Slack, and it's a community of like hundreds of practitioners and researchers who are interested in experimenting with online self-governance. Thanks very much. I think we have a few minutes for questions.
Thank you so much for that presentation. We already have people in the queue. So I cannot see the queue anymore. Where's the queue?
I think I see Michael.
Oh, yes. Okay, I see. Michael, I think. Yeah.
Yeah,
Sorry.
no, thanks for that. Really enjoyed the presentation there. A question, if we think about, I was thinking a lot about like Karl Popper while you were talking, and open societies and things like that. And then I was thinking about how easily manipulatable large bodies of populations are when we have instantaneous great communication over the internet, and the effects that have come from that in lots of both good and bad ways, right? So how do you balance the fact that bad people exist and are really good at manipulating people for more money and power?
Great question. And like, let's get into it. I mean, to me, it's like, this is a signal of the problem I'm trying to point to, is that like, to even imagine that this is a new challenge, right? I mean, in other kinds of contexts, we've been dealing with that problem of bad people, right? Forever. And we've kind of insulated ourselves from that problem in certain respects through this feudalist logic. But for instance, if you look at, say, the experience around governance and blockchains, there's a certain solution space that has emerged. One has been the use of economic incentives to enforce a kind of alignment. Another has been finding ways to bring persistent identities into systems that don't have persistent identities. There are other contexts, say Reddit, where where pseudonymous forms of self-governance have worked pretty well using reputation systems, right? So there are actually a lot of tools at our disposal for thinking through this challenge. And of course, our solutions for building trust in online spaces are going to look a little different from how we do it in spaces, say, like a neighborhood where everybody lives in the same place and knows each other and sees each other, or a country where there's a concept of citizenship and that sort of thing. But actually what we've seen, to me, for instance, in the context of blockchains, is that when you start entering into challenges like this, some really, really cool creative solutions can come up. So thank you for that.
Next, I see Jonathan.
Sorry, I'm trying to take notes and questions. Sorry.
Thank you for taking notes.
So I was really intrigued by what you said about diffusing power to either workers or to users, because it seems to me to do that, you also have to diffuse responsibility to them. And I think that's a very scary suggestion, like the idea that I, as a user of Reddit, now have some legal liability for what other people do on the platform. I think that actually is probably a non-starter, right?
I think it really depends on the context, like, and in that kind of space, yeah, of course, like we don't want one person to have to be responsible for what another pseudonymous user does. So let's not design the system in such a way that they do.
But isn't that what it means to diffuse power? Isn't that literally what it means?
No, I mean, there are all kinds of structures that we have to manage liability responsibly, from limited liability corporations to,
Which is putting all the power in the CEO.
not necessarily.
No?
I mean, it's like, do shareholders, hold all responsibility for the actions of other shareholders? No, I think that we can devise systems, as we have in other contexts, to appropriately distribute both responsibility and power. And I think, you're very right that those need to be conjoined, right?
Yeah.
The recognition that, and that's something that, for instance, in these crypto experiments, like, people have done largely through economic means to say, okay, if you want power in the system, you need to show that you have financial stake in the system, and power emanates from that.
Yeah. Thank you.
Again, like, these, I think, are interesting design spaces, and I hope that we don't assume in either our politics or in our everyday lives that, like, the proper solution to a hard challenge is authoritarianism.
Hi, Mark Nottingham. Thanks for the talk. That was great. Longtime fan of your work, so it's great to see that. I'm just curious. It seems like you're talking mostly here about where governance is coincident with the community being governed, online especially. And to me, the kind of thing that I've been thinking about and wondering about for a long time is how this explicitly applies to what happens here in internet standards. Because we are a governance mechanism in some fashion, but there are other governance mechanisms as well, and we are certainly not democratic. I don't think we're even multi-stakeholder. Please don't kill me right now. There's some really interesting questions around what the legitimacy of this organization is and what its edges are. And I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, one of the reasons why I was so excited to come to this is because I wanted to this is my first time at IETF, and I wanted to experience it and to begin learning about it. One thing that I've really appreciated is the need to think about different kinds of social structuring entities, right? I mean, I've spent a lot of my the last decade, for instance, focused on cooperatives as a kind of template for how we could co-governed online space. A cooperative is a certain kind of legal entity, a certain kind of business entity, and that might be appropriate for some things. But for instance, the design and governance of protocols, I've been learning a lot from this initiative out of the Ethereum Foundation, the Summer of Protocols. We have some folks here in the room who've been involved in that. That is all about developing literacy around this other practice of governance around protocols. And protocols work differently than cooperatives. You know, there isn't a clear sense of membership. It's not a kind of permissioned body. It's something that people adopt or don't. And I think you know, this challenge invites us, I think, to look at legacies like the IETF and ask, hey, are there lessons from this that could apply to more of our online spaces? Like, in some respects, I wonder if, you know, the jewels are hidden here that actually could be shared much more widely about how to co-govern online flows, and maybe how not to.
Yeah, the how not to is an important one there too.
Hi, Andrew Campling. I must admit, I wasn't expecting to hear that last thing applied to the IETF, but there you are. A couple of thoughts, or a couple of comments first, and then a question. Right at the very start, you said about, for example, Mark Zuckerberg giving away power. I question whether he was, or whether he was simply preempting legislative action. So what he actually did was to act to retain power. I think you had a very charitable interpretation of his actions and motivations, but
that's fair.
There you are. In terms of,
I've insulted him a lot in my career, so
fair enough. In terms of putting the power to moderate on your side into the hands of users and workers, not just CEOs, I think the issue which I think Jonathan sort of touched on, that's really complicated by sort of legal absolutes, and also by multiple jurisdictions that many of these platforms operate in. So things which I might think are perfectly reasonable and wouldn't want to moderate might actually be illegal in a different jurisdiction. So whilst you can probably delegate responsibility for stuff, I think it's be almost impossible to delegate accountability, certainly in most legal frameworks. And I'd be interested in your thoughts on that sort of responsibility versus accountability, and that whether that puts boundaries around what's actually possible here.
Yeah, there's so much in that, and I think it's a really thorny challenge. But I do think, again, it's an important challenge. You know, we've kind of delegated a lot of the question of accountability to the jurisdictions that the major platforms happen to be in, and the United States has been one. I think we're entering into a moment where, or we've entered into a moment where it's clear that that's not really working for the world, and other jurisdictions are trying to, you know, get in on this challenge too. I think there is a need to, you know, on the one hand, create some buffers to enable communities to have the kind of power that they need. I talked about things like labor unions. That's a strategy that we've historically used to enable a distribution of voice and power in the context of companies. There are some interesting parallels that could develop there. Another is around protecting companies from the behaviors of their users, which we've already done with things like Section 230. So we already have some legacies to build on in terms of how to do interesting distributions of this sort of thing. But I think there's also a question that is a little more radical here in what you're suggesting. This I really get to at the end of my book, and that I'm really wrestling with still, you know, very much in my future work, which is, are we actually, if we were to actually be able to practice democracy online, are we creating a kind of new concept of citizenship? I certainly see that in the crypto world, right? Where people are building these entities that are kind of intentionally designed outside of existing territorial jurisdictions. And there are some interesting legal responses or approaches to that. For instance, some of the legal tools being used to incorporate DAOs with blockchains are attempts to get governments to actually just kind of give permission to enable what the blockchain does to be legitimate. And so there are some interesting moves there that could suggest that maybe we're talking about the emergence of new kinds of jurisdictions that have, you know, a little more autonomy than a platform that's rooted in a particular country. If we are to become, you know, co-governors of our networks in the way that like IETF is a site of international co-governance of protocols that occurs among a blob of people who are not territorially defined. You know, do these kinds of things need to be more common in our governance lives? Do we need like layers? I end the book with an image of this website, native-land.ca, which is a map of indigenous territories around the world. And the place I live has 3 overlapping territories, the Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho. These are people who all lived in the same place at the same time through migratory patterns of these sorts of things. And so it's a reminder that, you know, we've lived in contexts of overlapping governance regimes before, and maybe this world of networks is inviting us into a different way of mapping the governance of our world.
Hey, Nathan, I hope you can hear me.
Yes, hi Mallory.
Great. Hey, I'm so sorry I couldn't be there, but I'm really glad you are. And so, yeah, I read the doc. In this case, I read your book. And two concepts I wanted to pull together that I think are interesting is you already mentioned them, you know, the voice versus exit as a way of just being able to negotiate one's place in any kind of platform, any kind of context. And that on the internet, it seems like really especially in social media, right, the only option we have is if we don't like it, we just leave. So exit is very overcorrected for. And I wonder if that isn't connected to the other concept of permissionless innovation, where, you know, the internet was kind of designed as like, well, you can come along if you want to. If you speak these protocols, you can be on the network. And then that's kind of it. And I kind of implicit in that feels like if it isn't working out, you can always leave or go to another network. And I feel like that fractal of exit kind of goes all the way down. So maybe one of the challenges I think to thinking about governance at this lower protocol layer, it's why I think we're not really grabbing onto how governance happens down here, other than obviously in the IETF. And then the other challenge I feel like is something that we face a lot in HRPC, which is like there aren't a lot of humans, like real end user humans talking protocol and invisible in these lower layer protocols. So there isn't a lot of opportunity to either get meaningful consent, you know, in a case of privacy issues or other kinds of things where this crops up. So not a question for you, but I think it really pulls together 2 threads that you've been discussing in terms of why does it feel so hard to practice governance or to invite governance by people at the protocol layer, even though we would like that for proliferating democracy, et cetera.
Oh, yeah, thank you. I mean, there's so much there. You know, that idea of exit and voice, of course, comes from Albert Hirschman, that economist, and you know, I think, you know, it's a kind of classic account of the need to, in any organization, to kind of balance the roles of exit and voice. And one additional distinction that I developed with my colleague Seth Frey is this idea of the difference between this is the worst academic distinction ever, sorry, effective voice and affective voice. Okay, 1 letter change. Affective voice is the ability to yell in a room and be heard. You know, we have that here. This is the form of voice we tend to have in online spaces, and it feels very cool. It feels very powerful. I get to post a tweet and it can go viral, right? I can be heard, and like, you know, the powerful will quake, right? sometimes. But what we almost never have is effective voice, which is like a ballot box, which is like being able to do something that the powerful don't have to want to hear, but are forced to hear anyway. You know, something that can actually say, remove an admin from their role, even if they don't want to leave. And that's something that we almost never see. You know, I think a really interesting innovation, and again, not to harp on this too much, that blockchains introduced in I think a pretty novel way, is the idea of developing protocols that have their own forms of effective voice built in, and allow the kind of future iterations of the protocol to be actually developed through the governance defined in the protocol itself. And Kalia mentioned this in terms of the IETF in an earlier session in ways that I really appreciated, that distinguish between like a kind of constitutional governance and the IETF's governance as protocol-based governance. And so I think it's a really interesting question to ask ourselves as we develop protocols, is when we develop a protocol, can we actually encode the future iteration of that protocol, the future development of that protocol into the protocol itself or into another protocol that has some power over it?
Hi, thank you for your presentation, Nathan. My name is Elliot Lear. I didn't start to do this, but I ended up in a situation where I now, or at least I'm given the illusion of running a 9,600 person group on Facebook, in which I am like, moderating is not something I really wanted to do, but I'm sort of forced into it because, well, you know, and obviously Facebook doesn't really give you the tools to do the sort of democratic moderation that one would like without really destroying a group. Which brings me to my other point, which is right now in the IETF, we are going through a small, not a major, but a small crisis over how to deal with misbehavior or dysfunction. And it may be an interesting study case, but we agreed this week that we were going to try to form a working group to fix what has happened in terms of the what some would call toxic, I would call cruel approach that we have towards when we have somebody that needs to be expelled from a list or have their posting rights blocked. So first of all, I'd invite you onto the mod discuss list to perhaps share some points of view. But more to the point, I think one of the questions we need to grapple with is there too much democracy in some cases, or are we using our voices wrong in terms of allowing people to be cruel or even libelous in some cases? And if you have thoughts on that, I'd love to hear them.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think we in a lot of these things have to learn lessons from like the way we've done virtually everything else in human history, right? You know, for instance, like due process, you know, having processes that for one reason or another are perceived as legitimate, processes that are designed to balance like cost with rigor, that are local. You know, this might not be the issue with IETF, but I think one deep problem in a lot of social media moderation is that people are subject to these rules that are supposed to be global and universal, when in virtually every other context, we make rules locally and we enforce them locally. And in so many of these kinds of cases, what you say about like the excess of democracy, I think is an outpouring of what I would call affective voice with a lack of an accountable process, right? And that some people call cancel culture, right? Which is you can complain really, really loudly about somebody, but there's no process where you actually have to like bring forward a clear case, you know, and make that case just to somebody who has the clear power to make a determination on it. And so, you know, in so many respects, I think what we really need to do again is like catch up our online spaces and our, you know, our online adjacent spaces to things that kind of we know how to do and we've done in other contexts. You know, that the folks doing the transformative justice work too have done a lot around, how do you build processes where people can all feel heard and that are opt-in, but that are able to adjudicate conflicts responsibly. I think it's a really deep question. A group of friends are working on some protocols around conflict resolution that I hope will help. I think, like, for instance, the introduction of codes of conduct has been a really, really important intervention. One of my great heroes, Coraline Emke, fought hard for that in a lot of open source communities, as have many others. But one issue that Coraline and I always talk about around this is that a lot of those codes of conduct don't actually specify the enforcement mechanisms in the due process. I think that's the next phase.
Hi, I'm Vittorio Bertola, and I have a personal word of caution. I like your ideas, but I think that one thing is if you try to apply them to small niche communities of informed people, like some of the blockchain ones, or like the IETF could be. A different thing is if you try to then apply the principle to mass social media for moderation or these kind of things. And I'm saying this because you made me feel younger, because your second last slide, was exactly the political platform that 20 years ago across Europe was pushed by the wave of pirate parties, including the online democracy. And so in Italy, I was part of that. The Italian incarnation was something called the 5-Star Movement. I don't know if you ever heard about it. And I was one of its early leaders coming from digital rights activism. And when we started, we were really like the few learned people that really liked the ideas, and it worked great. It was really, a new form of citizenship, like you said, and people started to join, and we were discussing, community-owned utilities. But then when we started actually to grow and gain success, and we got substantial percentages of votes at the election, then the average people came. And then it became a disaster, because if you start to have this kind of online peer-to-peer discussion with the average person, you would propose, okay, now we're getting into power, let's start the community-owned utility. And someone would say, no, let's just get the state to give free money to everyone and just make public debt for the next couple of generations. And that gets more votes on this online voting. Or let's build a new cooperative to get more workers' rights. No, let's just blame the African immigrants. And so people started to blame the African immigrants. So that's what happened. And it ended up becoming the worst form of populism, racism. And so you have to be very careful. So I don't think that this can easily work for a mass environment. Because if you did that today on Facebook, I think the result would be that, like, the anti-vaxxers, flat earthers, whatever you want to call them, would be the biggest, or at least the most organized and vocal group, and would take over the moderation, and that's what we would get.
Yeah, thank you. There's so much in that. First of all, I take I've learned a lot about the kind of tools you need to enable shared ownership from Italy. And part of that begins with the Italian Constitution, which has a right to cooperation written into it. And backing that up, Italy has one of the most robust structures for enabling the financing of shared ownership. And resultingly has one of the most vibrant cooperative sectors in the world.
We were a quasi-communist country, so
what's that?
We were an almost communist country.
Well, but it wasn't just that. One of the great, to me, one of the most important aspects of that history is it was both the communists and the Catholics who did that. And so coming from two different directions. On the point about mass participation, I think it's so right. And again, it goes back to the question of, like, how would you set it up to enable responsible stewardship, right? And when people have the ability to say stuff and not actually be held accountable for it, you end up with things like this. And I think that just invites, okay, let's find the right processes to match the challenges. And one thing that I've been really enthusiastic about recently is, in the context of many governments, there's a lot of experimentation now in citizen assemblies, right? Which invite people to come together and think about problems holistically, not just what am I gonna like, or what am I gonna throw a vote in and then walk away and run, but instead, like, I'm in a process, I'm hearing from experts, I'm accountable to other people. And that produces very different kinds of outcomes than, say, a Reddit thread. And so I think this is just a question for us to say, first, like, can we get the power to co-govern? And then the really interesting work happens, which is, okay, how are we going to set this thing up? I'm just curious, are we okay on time? We've gone way over what I was expecting.
Yes, so we're okay on time, but maybe the last two questions could be quick.
Okay.
We just have 2 more people to go, and that's all.
Okay, thank you.
This is very interesting, slippery slope topic. And when I'm looking at this, there's what's technically possible and do it within the technological, physical, realm, what, where your limitations are. And then you're entering the metaphysical one when you are trying to say, okay, what else can be done and what are the implications of the physical part on our daily life, et cetera, et cetera. I sometimes compare internet to the Hyde Park corner. Anyone can bring a box to Hyde Park and they can start talking about anything they want as long as people will listen to them. Nobody has to listen to them, but they can go there and talk whatever they want within the freedom of speech that is defined in the UK.
And usually pushing it in some respect.
And usually pushing it in some respect. Now, the freedom of speech in the UK, so the UK legal system is very similar to the US legal system, but the UK freedom of speech is more restrictive and the US freedom of speech is more permissive. They are using the same foundations, but they went into different actions. Now, how can you be accountable for something what you would be accountable in the UK? You're not accountable in the US. And this now, as we built a global platform, this is now a huge implication where we are saying we enable anyone and everyone to set up a Hyde Corner box and suddenly have a global audience. And the question is now how to limit that. If you start using the limitations in the technical part, then suddenly you are, so this case, then you can start looking to how to prevent cancer. How much of the good thing you want to cut out in order for the bad thing to prevent. But then sometimes you can cut out too much of the good thing and then everything else dies. So it's a constant cat and mouse game on what can be done and what could be agreement. Unfortunately, the many good things that humans have, our civilizations has developed, can be used for the bad things. And then how to restrict that use. And
no, thank you. And I mean, again, I think this comes back to that affective and effective voice question, which is, when I first went to Hyde Park, to the speaker's corner, I was really excited because I'm like weirdly obsessed with democracy because I had some good experiences with it as a teenager. And that in some respects is kind of my goal in life, is like enable more teenagers to have good experiences with democracy. So I've been experimenting with online games for this stuff, and like mods and things like that. I think you're right that what we have is Hyde Park Speaker's Corner. And when I went to hear it, I was like, oh, this is actually very boring. Because it's like a bunch of people who have no power to do anything, ranting unaccountably about whatever they want, right? They're talking into a world that they don't actually have to live in, And I think there is something different that occurs when you have that effective voice and you actually have to live in the world and experience the consequences of what you've been ranting about. And there is a process for adjudicating, what rants are we actually going to hear, or are we actually gonna embrace? And so this is really a call to say, okay, we've done the Hyde Park thing. We've done we have Twitter where we have to listen to all the nonsense and that the whole world has to offer. Let's actually have spaces where people have to come together and make decisions and do something. One thing I've experienced in social movements, and I used to be a social movement reporter, is I would often hear people like in a protest or something feel like, this is the first time I've ever felt heard. and on the one hand, it was kind of a beautiful thing, but on the other hand, you would see this kind of move from, like, initially they just rant and rant and rant, and then 5 days later, they'd be like, their opinions had totally changed and they had kind of calmed down and were starting to get to work. You know, and it's that process I hope we can start to kind of move into collectively, is move from the sense that the internet is a place to just blab forever, you know, and speak into the void, and instead move it into a place, into being a place where we have some real power and responsibility and we are citizens.
Yes, so thank you. We still have one person in the queue, but maybe let's take it offline because we have run over a lot of time. But thank you very much, Nathan. There's also really lively, lovely conversation in the chat if you are later interested.
Thank you so much, all of you.
Yes. Thank you very much.
Can I just quickly ask as note taker, if anybody asked a question that was, you know, more than like 2 sentences long, to go into the notes and actually type out what their whole question was, because typing out essays is quite hard.
Yes. Perfect. Thank you, Jonathan. It's Ali over there.
Yep, I'm here.
Okay. I also have your slides.
Thank you.
Are you able to run them yourself or no?
No, I will ask you.
Okay, perfect. No worries. I will do so. Okay. So up next we have Ali Rezaki from Nokia, and he will be speaking about designing networking technology for value outcomes, challenges, and gaps. So go for it, Ali.
Thanks, Sophia. Good afternoon. It's great to be here. Today I want to share with you, let's say, different approach to technology development we are trying in one of our research projects, and many other projects are also attempting to do this. Basically, we are trying to connect high-level goals and values that matter for planet and people to what we are developing as technology enablers, and how can we form the link and the feedback. And I want to share with you some of the challenges we faced, and that we realized that collaboration across disciplines and transdisciplinary methods would help us in our challenge. Next slide, please. Sorry. Yep. Thanks, Sophia. So on the left-hand side, you see some of these global goals and values, which are broadly inspired by UN SDGs and other, let's say, intergovernmental organizations' outputs. Resilience, security and privacy, safety, trustworthiness, inclusion, fairness, equity, nature preservation, climate change mitigation, and decent jobs, livelihoods, health, education, and fulfilling lives. So we try to start from these global values. And on the right-hand side, it's the things that we work in IETF and elsewhere, like routing, DNS, MPLS, TLS, cryptographic algorithms, IPv6, and all these technologies. How can we relate these two sets of, let's say, concepts and ensure that they are feeding each other and they are, let's say, fulfilling requirements and benefits? And ultimately, I guess that the technology we develop is providing support to reach these global goals. Next slide, please. So if I restate our problem and why we are trying to do this, we want to create technologies to support global human and planetary goals while containing the technology's negative impacts, which we see in the footprint that we have. And we want to capture that for the environment, society, and economics domains, which have been called in literature the 3 pillars of sustainability. And the ultimate outcome from this effort would be that these dual transformations we are seeing today of digitalization and decarbonization are mutually reinforcing. Next slide, please. Then I guess this boils down to a translation. We are after this translation from these high-level goals into technology enablers, because otherwise it becomes very hard to manage what to ask from technologists like us, or the IETF working groups, or IRTF working groups. The discussions, if this translation doesn't happen, it remains at high level. We discuss about fairness, about equity, about environmental outcomes, reducing GHGs. However, then we are unable to translate this to technology requirements. So what does the technology has to deliver so that we have more equity, more democracy, and we are really searching for this translation. And the attempt we have, or the tool we are using these days, is through this key value process, the key value, and we try to come up with some indicators of key value, meaning that the feedback from the technology impact is hopefully, let's say, changing or impacting these values we started with. There is a reference for a paper that sets the theory and the, let's say, practice behind this. Next slide, please. So if I were to represent this visually, in the core you see our old way of developing technology. We see a challenge and we, let's say, design for optimizing a parameter. This could be latency, this could be providing bandwidth, this could be connectivity, and then we develop optimal technology to solve that problem. That's the usual KPI, key performance indicator based methodology. Then, let's say some decades ago, the use case process came about, that we realized that the technology should solve a problem. It should have a context, it should have users, it should have outcomes. But what we ended up very often is that we have a technology and we build a use case around it, unfortunately. And that always aims to, let's say, put the technology in a positive context. We always start with the concept that I have a technology, it must be good for everyone. That's the kind of use cases we come up with, unfortunately, usually. Then, when the discussions about sustainability emerged, and let's say we came to realize that the global challenges are really complex, they require systems thinking, there are huge number of feedback loops, and there are lots of moving parts. Then the realization came that we should start from these high-level goals, and we should aim for desired outcomes related to these goals. And not only that, we design our technology through this process, but we should also care about the feedback back to the goals we started, so that our technology has a better chance to impact the goals. And also in the process, we manage our negative impact as well, the so-called footprint. It's in theory, it seems to make sense, but when we try to exercise this mostly as a technology community, we run into some challenges. Next slide, please. So we realize that when we design for these values and we design from values towards use cases, towards technology, we don't have the know-how. It was mentioned earlier, perhaps, that as technologists, we don't know all the environmental, social, economic perspectives. Yet we are asked to deliver this technology in a short time frame. We are mostly working in companies that have tight time frames, and how do we manage this? So we don't have the capability to design these use cases for values on our own. Yet these interdisciplinary collaboration does not exist in large scale in technology development. So we realized this. Then that means we need the expertise of social sciences, economic sciences in our use case definitions, goal definitions, and assessments. So these should be, let's say, independent of the technologists. We should receive requirements. We should, let's say, develop requirements externally to our technology development process. Not only that, when we design a technology, internet technology, access technology, mobile, fixed, we only know a bit of the technical landscape. We don't have control over all the aspects of a use case. When I design a communication system for a, let's say, industrial application that includes robots making decisions and collaborating, I don't have the know-how of the robotics or the AI, but I focus on networking, then I'm missing lots of important parts. So how do we get around this challenge? We have limited control on many things. This is the, let's say, outcome part. Where we realize we have control is our footprint in terms of these values, in terms of environmental, social, and economic. So we are now focusing more on managing our footprint. But we realize the limitation of this, of course, in meeting the goals of this key value indicator oriented design process. But this is a, let's say, call for help maybe, so that we can create more collaborations. And also in technology development, we are, let's say, a bit challenged in terms of dealing with qualitative things. We want metrics. We have seen both earlier in the day of energy measurements. We want to deal with numeric things in the technology land. We want to measure, we want to improve, we want to establish causality, but that doesn't always exist when we talk about values and value outcomes. Next slide, please. But we realize that this is already worked out, or a common challenge in the social and economic sciences. Here is a table that I interpreted from a UN Human Rights Indicator report. Basically, there are qualitative and quantitative metrics or indicators you can work with, and your assessment can be fact-based, which is objective, or judgment-based, subjective. And we can deal with these things differently, and they are still valid assessments. So we are supposed to learn to work with this qualitative and subjective perspectives. But in the technology world we are used to, it's quite an uncommon, let's say, practice. Next slide, please. So with this realization, we are trying to form teams that are multi-stakeholder. As much as we can in our research projects, we are trying to include social scientists, economists, and environmentalists to form teams to, let's say, handle these challenges together. And it is working reasonably, but we are still feeling that this translation is really elusive, because there are so many moving parts, and that it's really hard to isolate the impact of technology on a certain aspect of value outcomes. And that is stalling, I would say, the progress. We need to see really good examples. Next slide, please. So my call to action, if you like, is to form closer and more transparent collaborations among social, economic, and technology experts. We need to co-design technology. So I'm really glad to hear Nathan's presentation. Of course, it is maybe approaching things from the other direction. We are trying to reach out to feel how we can absorb the social and economic sciences expertise on our side. And we, in this exercise, of course, another key thing is we want to understand the limits of our technology, both in the environmental, social, and economics perspectives. One thing that you will see in many technologists is that they believe the technology they are developing is the best thing in the world. So it will be the answer to every problem they are addressing or they are feeling. Of course, there are disappointments, but during this phase, you will see that there is such a belief. Now, I'm working on sustainability. Many people use this word of saving the world, working on sustainability. But we have to be really realistic, and we have to understand what the limits are, and that collaboration can put this perspective. And basically, we are also after simplicity. When there are so many moving parts, and it becomes hard to manage, then this translation into technology doesn't work. So that's pretty much it. So we are trying to make this value-based technology design work, but lots of challenges. And I thought presenting here, maybe we could have some collaboration and learn from the experience of HRPC. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Yes. Thank you very much, Elise. So does anybody have any questions? Please join the queue. Yes, we have Arnaud. We only have 10 minutes, so maybe let's keep it quickly. But go ahead, Arnaud. Oh, okay, in person. Yes, okay, perfect.
Right. Thank you, Ali. Arnaud Tadei from Broadcom. So I like the intention, and this is really in the air of the days, because I have exactly the same problem in a completely different space called the ITU.
Mm-hmm.
And 2 days ago, I had to sleep 4 hours because I had to discuss this exact topic for 3 hours with CEPT. So the intention is good. We came to the same problem. How do we translate? Because if you take a step back and look at the stakeholders like member states, for them it's very simple. We take human rights, we take standardization, put them together, and it must work. That's never going to work this way. Mm. So the issue I see in your approach is that we tried in the T sector. We tried sincerely with the entire of Japan through Society 5.0 exactly on sustainability. And it didn't work. We try again locally on some areas with human rights, and it worked by recommendation. But what we realized is that it doesn't scale. And to make it scale, I believe your approach, and we'll be happy, not now because Sophia is going to be unhappy with you only have 10 minutes. I could spend quite some time with you to explain you why we can't go too simple. Because when we are going to elaborate on the deep issues that we are touching the problem of design.
Yep.
I have human rights or sustainability. I have standardization and technology, and we forget something in the middle called design.
Yep.
And design means a bit more than what I see on the screen. It's not based by indicators. I really am skeptical this is going to work. Mm-hmm. You are as well missing the ethics part. Mm-hmm. And what we are missing is the learning from other fields, like medicine.
Yeah.
So people in medicine, when they have to fix Alzheimer, for example, sorry, not Alzheimer, that's me who has Alzheimer already, Parkinson, sorry, they have to put a device in the brain. And the fact that you put this in the brain causes an enormous ethical issue because you're not just reading, you are writing. You know? Mm-hmm. So you can imagine the type of design issues they have. So you are right. When we design a technology, we are looking for a use case, but we forget that behind this, we're going to enable, disable some laws. And for each of the branch, we're going to enable, disable some ethical codifications. And at the end, we have the anthropology of it. And in our field, we are super arrogant. We believe that because we invented all of this, we are gods.
Yeah.
Think about the book of Yuval Harari. And it's not the thing that other fields have learned. We need to take a step back and realize we need to learn. Yeah. We need to train an entire generation of people on all of this before we are able to scale all of that. Mm-hmm. Because if we don't do that, I promise you the level of unanticipated bad stuff that we're going to have at the end of the chain, even with all our good intentions, is going to be gigantic. I will stop at that. Happy to discuss with you offline.
Thanks. I look forward to that. And I think we have limited capability to learn everything. So I think we have to work collectively in teams and solve problems collectively. Yeah.
Thanks. Hello, so I'm Simone from W3C. And so we share the same problem and the same interest to try to understand which is the impact of a technology on the human rights. Mm-hmm. And we are now focusing, probably also as in each SDO, on the identity, and we are running an experiment on how to understand the impact of a specific technology, in our case of decentralized credentials. And we are using methodology taken by security, which is threat modeling, with a threat list extracted from the research from Access Now, that they have a specific campaign YID.
Can you come closer?
Okay, a specific campaign for YID for harms in identities. And we found also useful and a most generic approach, which is the one from Microsoft about the R modeling, and they have all categories of human rights problem. For example, for opportunity loss, just to take an example, or economic loss, or also environmental problems. So if you like to experiment, feel free to join forces to do that together. For now, it's really interesting and useful. The results are really, really good.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks very much. I would appreciate learning more. Thank you.
Thanks for the talk. I was just wondering, just a couple of thoughts there. Especially, for instance, in the public sector, there's often the talk that folks need to be upskilled on the technical side.
Yeah.
Should there be the reverse being done in the corporation side of being upskilled from a human rights perspective or various ethical aspects as less, in some sense, as a necessary aspect of our work? Because the implications of our work go there, but we're not necessarily always trained, right? So that's, I don't know if you have thoughts on that. I was also wondering if there are elements in these kind of frameworks as to, like, for instance, through the impact assessments in the loop diagram, where you decide, okay, we just don't develop the technology.
Yes.
And stuff. Okay.
Yeah, it's in that paper reference. If there are many iterations, mitigations applied, and if the result is that feasibility is not achieved, you stop that use case and the technology enabler. About upskilling, I think we are working in a specialization-oriented world, and we have limited capacity to learn different specializations. So I think it is really important to collaborate as interdisciplinary teams. We shouldn't be in, I would say, illusion that I will learn all the necessary things and solve my problem. It's really a collaborative effort we are after, I would say. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Ali. That was really wonderful.
Thanks, Sophia.
Yes, so thank you everyone for attending this session. There's no more speakers, so we're going to close the room at that. So thank you very much for being in the room, and we see each other hopefully at the next IETF. So thank you. See you.